And this is the contrast and the dilemma for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, is that where they patently had bought in and Labour was regularly getting opinion polls well over 50%, that isn't the case at the moment. So it's a problem for both the major political parties. It's a problem for democracy, because I do fear that at the general election we will have a low turnout because people will say, well, plague on all your houses.
So, while of course the big question out of the budget is whether it will keep the economy on the straight and narrow, in an election year there's also the other major question over what it could do to help the Tories in the polls. Let's talk all of that through with polling expert and Conservative peer Robert Hayward. Lord Hayward, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, I mean, the big question is, has the budget had any impact at all on the polls that you've seen?
There's not an immediate impact. The only polling of which I'm aware that I don't like is the overnight polls, because people give the answers they're expected to a large extent. But the Conservative Party continues to flatline in terms of its polling. It hasn't moved, and it hasn't moved effectively for quite a few months. If anything, slight decline.
And is that what you would expect? Because after the autumn statement, there was a little bit of a movement in the polls, but we haven't seen anything so far for this time round.
No, I think the thing about the autumn statement was that it came as a surprise, a pleasant surprise at last, was this spring, although it was the autumn in terms of statements, because it was the first positive economic news that the government had been able to really put forward for a very long time. Interest rates, taxation, everything else was going up. So I think there was a sense of relief. This time, the budget is seen as a continuation of that, a clarification of the position. In general, the economists have given it reasonably good assessment. They've not gone berserk. They've not said, David Smith in the Times has said it's reasonable, it's clarified the position. And I think that's probably why it's not had the effect that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister would have hoped.
Which will lead you to the question, if you are the Conservative Party, is there anything that you could do to shift the polls?
Obviously, as every week goes closer to the general election, then it becomes more difficult for them. The probable economic next impact would be the inflation figures. They were indicated by the Chancellor that they would reach 2% a year earlier than expected. That's likely to be the May figures, which are published in June, which would then possibly generate the good news of a reduction in interest rates. So the government's got to hope that that's the case. Whether people are still listening or not is another matter. But it is a problem. But one shouldn't say this is all good news for Labour, because in the polls, they are perceived as not the change party, and the support is not that strong. It's going to parties like the Reform and Greens, etc. So, problem all round.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because, as you say, the ratings, for example, for both party leaders are pretty poor. I mean, have we ever been in a situation like this where respect for the governing party and the opposition party seems to be so low, and yet one party is miles ahead? It seems always paradoxical.
It does. I can't recall, and I can't find a parallel for this. If you and I recall very well the period of 1995-97, and there was absolutely no question at that point the public had bought into Tony Blair, they'd bought into the Labour Party. And this is the contrast and the dilemma for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, is that where they patently had bought in and Labour was regularly getting opinion polls well over 50%, that isn't the case at the moment. So it's a problem for both the major political parties. It's a problem for democracy, because I do fear that at the general election we will have a low turnout because people will say, well, plague on all your houses.
And in terms of an impact from Labour's response to the budget, is that something that there's been any polling on? Because there's this question about where the money will come from, that the non-dom tax cut that the government, well, the non-dom tax changes that the government has sort of taken out from under Labour. There's some question about what that might do to trust in Labour's economic planning.
It does cause them a problem. It's a deliberate bear trap by the government, by Jeremy Hunt. And throughout the budget statement, the number of times, I haven't counted it, that Jeremy Hunt said that the Labour Party had no plan, they do have a problem because they've got to be able to identify what they're going to do, not just with no longer having the money for the non-dom tax available to them, but just economically in general. And that's part of their problem with the public at large. So they are going to have to identify what they're going to do. But having said that, Rachel Reeves is having an effect, and the Labour Party are getting a response from business in a way that they have not done for a very long period of time.
And just finally, there's been this back and forth all week about whether or not it was wise for the government to focus on national insurance, because their suggestion is that people don't really understand it. It would be much easier to explain an income tax cut. Is there any truth in that? Because surely people understand a tax cut's a tax cut.
No, they don't. They perceive things in
Right.
different ways. And actually, the problem with any tax cut is actually the people who don't get the tax cut, who voice the resentment and the disapproval. And of course, national insurance cut does not apply to pensioners. And therefore, they are upset. Having said that, how upset they are, one's not really sure. But it is the case that the people who don't get the benefit from something are the ones who shout loudest. And in this case, it's the pensioners.
It's the pensioners. Robert Hayward, thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with us and taking us through all of that. And you can keep letting us know what you think about the budget, any impact it's had on you, whether it might change your vote